There's still people coming in. Right. All right. Oh, here comes Gail. I think almost all of the committee are here. All right. So shalom, shalom. Good evening, everyone. So let me push this back a little. It's so lovely to see all of your faces. And welcome as we open this year's women's retreat. So in the past, as you know, we've had one day, a glorious, fantastic day where we fill up TBZ and we get to be together, gathered around a particular theme. But this year we're virtual, which gives us the opportunity to spread this moment of togetherness out over the week. So hopefully you'll join us for the other gatherings that we have planned for the week, and that I'll put that chat, I'll put the link for the whole schedule for the week in the chat in a moment. So this year our theme, we were thinking, at first, let me start by thanking our committee. This year's committee was built on the foundations of last year's committee, and of course the committees past who have come up with our women's retreats in the past. But this year I want to thank Rabbi Carol Glass, Diane Balzer, Miriam Diamond, Hilda Lopez, Carol Kamen, and Gail Reamer for coming together and really thinking through what is meaningful for us for this year. And, we're here in this pandemic year and socially distant, some people feeling isolated. So we felt that a topic that we could all come together and learn around is sisterhood and resilience. So that is our theme, finding strength together. That's our theme for this year. And we're going to start with that tonight in discussing this fantastic panel. Just a couple of highlights from the week, not that anything is a low light, but just things that are off the top of my head. Tomorrow night, Rav Claudia's class is starting with Leah Hagar Cohen on After Abel and other midrashic stories. There's the book. We're having an artistic experience of resilience on Tuesday afternoon. There's been a date change. It's now on Tuesday with the artist Helene Ayalon. Wednesday, Gail Reamer is teaching Torah study. And Thursday, Becca Mautner is continuing the introduction that she gave before the Megillah on how the Megillah really reflects women's lives, really gender roles, and the dynamic between women and men in everyday life, including down to today. So those are some of the highlights on Friday, right before Shabbat. You'll get to experience a play written by Miriam Diamond, and who will also lead us in text study around Lecha Dodi. And then we'll go right into Shabbat. And on Shabbat morning, we are blessed to have Kathy Cates leading us in yoga. And then after services, we're going to have a panel of Benot Mitzvah, of young women who have recently become Benot Mitzvah, talking about what sisterhood and friendship means to them. And we'll close the whole week with Havdalah next Saturday night. So hopefully you can join us for some or all of this fantastic programming. So I am now pleased and grateful to turn it over to Rav Claudia.
Thank you, Rav Tiferet. Thank you all for being here. It's really wonderful to start this women's retreat this way, though I would prefer 1,000 times that if it was Sunday morning at whatever it is, 8:30, when we all start to arrive and have that amazing breakfast that we have every year, that Suzanne Gelber and Enid Schulman make sure that we have every year now for 9 years. It's been amazing. And we dive in together and we start a day of learning and community. But this is our new reality, hopefully not for too much long, and we do our best, and hopefully we'll be able to have some of that experience this year during the whole week. I'm very grateful to Rav Tiferet and the whole committee for putting this week together. It's been amazing to see what this is, how it is unfolding. And I'm excited about every program. I am excited. I'm in 2 panels. I'm in this one and then moderating the panel of Shabbat with a Benot Mitzvah. And I'm so excited about that one. It's been already amazing to prepare with those girls. So very exciting about what's happening. So I'm very excited to, it's kind of funny that Rav Tiferet and I are in the panel and we're also welcoming, but that's how it is. And I am excited to welcome who's going to be moderating our panel, Judith Rosenbaum, who is a TBZ member a long time now. Judith, I don't know how many years you have been now a TBZ member, but long enough to say that you have been at TBZ for a long time. Both of her kids were bar bat mitzvah a year and a half ago. So it's Judith, the kids, how do we know it's long time? Because your kids were very little. Aviv used to love the drumming with Ron next to him when he was very little, and now he's a teenager. So that's how you know the span of life in a synagogue. And Judith is as a feminist educator, historian, writer, and activist. And she's the CEO of the Jewish Women's Archive, which is playing an important role in documenting the history and impact of women in the Rabbinate. Judith teaches and lectures widely on Jewish studies and women's studies. She also serves on the faculty of Bronfman Fellowship and was recently awarded a Schusterman Fellowship for Jewish leaders. She regularly publishes in both academic and popular journals and is inspired by anarchist Emma Goldman, political activist Bella Abzug, writer and activist Grace Pelly, and other loud Jewish women, including those in her own family. And most importantly, Judith is the madrina, the godmother of my little one that is there. So I'm always happy to introduce Judith and all her achievements, but most importantly, to be the godmother of my children. So with that, Judith.
Thank you so much, Rav Claudia. I'm really delighted to be here and to help kick off this wonderful week of programming. The topic of women in the Rabbinate is such a great place to begin this week's exploration because it is a wonderful example of the ways that women have already had a huge impact in reshaping Jewish communities and Jewish ritual and Jewish interpretation and meaning making, as well as helping us reimagine models of authority and leadership. And one of the things that we see is that that's relevant not only in the Jewish community, but really has so much application and relevance and is part of the conversation about women and authority and leadership in all fields. It's also something that certainly speaks to our own community at TBZ because we see women leading every day. And so it's a wonderful way to both honor and explore that element of sisterhood and resilience in our own community, but also to connect it to the larger field. And one of the things that I think is also really important about this topic is that, I see it as a sort of almost like a sweet spot of feminist exploration, because when we look at women in the Rabbinate, it's both a place where we can very obviously see successes and achievements and progress, and it's a place where there's also obvious ongoing challenges. So I think it is a good topic for really delving into both a celebration of what has already taken place, and also to be able to kind of harness some of that positive energy of that celebration to continue the work together to continue this unfinished revolution. So I'm really excited to begin this conversation. Of course, it's only a beginning, but I'm sure that it will be a conversation that many of us will be continuing beyond this evening. And we have a wonderful panel of amazing rabbis to explore this with. So really nobody here really needs an introduction, but we'll do some quick introductions. Rabbi Carol Glass grew up in a non-observant, strongly identified conservative Jewish household. And though she does not think she was a geek, she admits to being one of those rare kids who liked Hebrew school. Carol saw her bat mitzvah preparation and her summers at Camp Ramah as especially formative for her Jewishly, although they were also simultaneously confusing and frustrating for a girl who thought of becoming a Jewish leader, and I'm sure we'll hear more about that from her. She graduated from Barnard in 1975, and then in 1976, while working on an MA in Jewish education at JTS, Carol co-founded the Jewish Women's Resource Center in New York City and began collecting and cataloging new creative Jewish ritual and liturgy born of feminist sensibilities. From 1977 to 79, she served a large conservative congregation in Minneapolis by filling the assistant rabbi position, but without the title. She was ordained by HUC in New York in 1984 and was among the first 100 female rabbis worldwide. And since then, Carol has worked as a Hillel rabbi, a pulpit rabbi, and a healthcare chaplain in various settings. She was the first dean of students at the Rabbinical School of Hebrew College, where she founded Ikvotecha, the school's spiritual direction program. She continues to companion seminarians in spiritual direction while also maintaining a small private practice. She writes curriculum for and facilitates Musar groups in Greater Boston, has studied Reiki energy healing. She's a gardener and an out-of-practice bird watcher. So many skills for her to bring. Rav Tiferet, who we all are very glad to have here as the Rabbi of Congregational Learning and Programming at TBZ. She received rabbinic ordination and a master's in Jewish education from Hebrew College in 2013. Rav Tiferet is originally from Brookline and has served congregations in Milwaukee and Mount Holly, New Jersey, before returning home to TBZ. And she's currently pursuing a doctorate in educational leadership at Lesley University in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And in her multifaceted career, she's had a front seat at the intersection of race, racism, and religion, which has given her many valuable insights into how different groups of people see the world, and refining her own powers of empathy, and we all benefit very much from that perspective and those gifts. Rav Claudia is our senior rabbi at TBZ. She grew up in Santiago, Chile, lived in Argentina. She moved to Israel in 1996 and received rabbinic ordination from the Schechter Institute of Jewish Studies in 2002. She was the first rabbi of Noam, the youth movement of the Masorti movement in Israel, which I actually belonged to when I was living in Israel in 7th grade. Would have loved to have her leadership then. Rav Claudia moved to the U.S. in 2004 and became the director of the Jewish Studies program at the Jewish Community Day School in Watertown. And she's been a part of TBZ since 2007, where she's been very deeply invested in growing the social justice programs at TBZ and engaging community members in meaningful experiences of prayer. Rav Claudia is the co-chair of New England J Street Rabbinic Cabinet. She's one of the chaplains of the fire department in Brookline. She has a very cool uniform. And she currently serves as a board member of Boston's JCRC and will be joining the board of Trua Rabbinic Call for Human Rights this coming summer. So welcome all of you. Really excited to hear your stories. And we're going to begin with the beginning of the story, which is, how is it that you all came to the rabbinate? Tell us a little bit about your path to the rabbinate. And we'll begin here. We'll go historically here. I'm a historian, so sometimes I like to go chronologically. And we'll begin with Carol.
Good evening. It's really exciting to be here. Just thinking, I never, ever could have imagined witnessing a panel like this, let alone being on a panel like this when I was growing up. Just to give you a little perspective, I grew up I was born in the 50s, in the early 50s, and in the conservative movement. And in 1958, a decision was made to allow women to have an aliyah to the Torah. So when I was a few years later preparing for my bat mitzvah, that was the big thing. Women couldn't read from the Torah. I didn't know of women that wore a talit. And my bat mitzvah was mainly Friday night. I helped lead part of the service. The part that I was permitted to lead Kabbalat Shabbat. So things have come quite a long way. And I always wondered because as Judith said, I loved Hebrew school and I soaked it up, and I could see that I knew and understood things that a lot of the boys in my classes could care less about. And it frustrated me that I wasn't allowed to carry my knowledge and my skills to fruition in many cases. When I was able to, I went to Camp Ramah, and there they let girls do a few more things. I made a talit, which I got to wear. And what I really take away from my years at camp, besides just learning Jewish things and really loving camp, was that I was surrounded by staff, many of whom were rabbinical students at JTS, at the seminary in New York. And after a while, I realized that I wanted to be like them. I loved the fact that they knew these things called midrash, and they always had stories and answers to questions, and they made Judaism interesting because they could embellish it. And it really didn't occur to me that they were all guys. That came later when I really was not able to go forward. When I got to college, I started to get involved in Jewish activity. The Hillel director at Barnard, it was at Columbia, was an Orthodox rabbi. And so there were more separations of men and women than I had been used to. And I began to look outside of my campus for activities, and I got involved with the New York Chavurah, where I met some of you who are here now, and Paula, and I think Judith, that's where I met your mother. And I learned, Paula Hyman, Aleha Shalom. I learned about women who were taking courageous steps behind the scenes of what was going on inside of synagogues. And the group Ezrat Nashim that Judith's mother was part of was making noise and saying to the conservative movement, you've got to let women do more things. And as I continued on in my path, I began to join them. And I just felt like this was something that I was being carried along in. And I found myself going to meetings and starting to collect information about things that I hadn't been taught. And I started to hear stories about women in Jewish history that had taken leadership roles. But I also learned that some of what girls and women were told we couldn't do was a matter of interpretation. And as I hung around the seminary more, because it wasn't far from Barnard, I started to listen to the teachings that helped me understand that there are many different opinions on a lot of positions in our tradition, and that there is a lot of discussion and back and forth, and that things weren't necessarily one way. So I spent a year of college in Israel, and it happened that the Yom Kippur War was during that time. And what happened is that I went to Pardes, a school in Jerusalem that was just starting. I was there the second year. And one of the things that will always stick in my mind is that we had that the only way they could get a minyan of men was to pull in either faculty or other men that weren't necessarily part of our group. And so usually they could manage that way to get 10. if they had all the guys from our group and then a couple of staff. But there was one guy in our group, God bless him, Rabbi Jeffrey Marker, who would refuse to allow himself to be counted in a minyan of men unless they also counted women. So a lot of times we'd have 10 men with Jeffrey, and he would leave the room, which would get everybody, all the other men, really, really angry. But I started to realize that there had to be a sense of humor in all this. And there had to be some fight, that we couldn't always just go by the rules. So in the next few years, I went and I applied to HUC, to Hebrew Union College, because I thought at the moment it was the only choice for me when I graduated from college. And I didn't get in. I was rejected. I decided I would go into Jewish education for the meantime, and I went to the seminary for my MA. And that was when I started to realize that I wanted to go beyond being able to work in a Jewish school. And by some, just, I don't know, maybe it was a miracle, I found my dream job. I was hired by a large conservative congregation in Minneapolis, which is a liberal Jewish community. And I replaced their assistant rabbi with an MA in Jewish education. And they basically, I did everything that he did except for weddings and funerals. And so what happened is that I was seen as a woman in a rabbinic position where the community was coming out. The women started to wear talitot, and I wore tefillin, so they started to wear tefillin. And they would come to me and say, you know, since you've been here, my daughter is feeling like she has a role model, and she's getting excited, and she wants to come to shul. And, you know, you are the person that I wish I could have been, but I was in the wrong generation. And we started a women's group. So I stayed there for 2 years, and then the seminary was working on the ordination, the question of the ordination of women. And during the 2 years I was in Minneapolis, they held testimonies, and people came out in Minneapolis and gave testimony about how women should be ordained. I came back to New York, and while I was there, oh, I see I'm starting to go over my time, so I will try to wrap this up. The seminary decided to delay the vote on the ordination of women. And what happened that next 6 months was very bizarre. There was a small group of us that had been involved in trying to push the ordination of women. We had demonstrations in front of the seminary. There was one demonstration where we chained the gates closed, and one of the male rabbinical students tied himself to the gates, Rabbi John Perlman, and it was quite amazing. And then once the vote happened to delay the ordination of women, delay a decision about the ordination of women, professors, either if they were against the ordination, they would see one of us walking down Broadway and they would cross the street. They didn't want to, you know, walk near us, or they didn't want to be confronted or whatever. They would cross the street, or others would come up and hug us, whether we knew them or not, because they thought we were so wonderful to be in this institution. And then the leaders, the highest up of the Talmud department, professors and Chancellor Gershon Cohen, started having a series of meetings with us where they proposed a new position that was going to be called the Shadar position, which you would take all the classes that rabbinical students took, but you would not be able to get the title rabbi. And that was published in the New York Times, and Gershon Cohen, Alav Hashalom, was so proud of it. And that's when I realized that I was just out of sync with the movement at that time. It was my home, and it really broke my heart because I felt like I had no place in my own home anymore. And I was ordained 5 years later in the Reform movement. I could tell you lots of other stories. I just want to say that the leadership that had been meeting with us got really, really shaken when all of the women, the six of us, seven of us, decided to make other plans for the following year, and none of us applied to the Shadar program. And when I went in to speak to one of them, I don't want to use names, and to tell him that I was leaving and what my plans were, he said, well, if you got to do that, I guess, but that's like going from Bloomingdale's to Alexander's, you know. So that was really all before I even applied to rabbinical school and finally got in. But I'm glad to be here with you tonight.
Thank you, Carol. There's so many important threads there, and I think, you know, both in terms of just the different approaches that were taken for a long time, and you know what the kind of different modes of change were from people kind of taking on the roles and showing that they could do it, and what an important impact they made in terms of role models, and the importance of education in you know, getting women to the point of realizing, wait, I have this education, so why can't I do this thing? And then also the outside agitation. And I remember my mom saying, and she wrote this actually for something for the Jewish Women's Archive in our exhibit about Jewish women and feminism, that it was 11 years from when Ezrat Nashim first made the demand that women, among other things, that women be allowed to become rabbis. It was 11 years from that moment in 1972 until the seminary decided to allow women into the rabbinical school. And that for those people who were, you know, advocating for that at the time, 11 years felt like a long time. But from her perspective as a historian, she felt like, well, 11 years actually is pretty quick. And I feel like that tension exists in this story, right? That on the one hand, in your lifetime, there's been this huge shift going from you know, fighting to get your foot in the door to women rabbis now who, you know, never knew a Judaism without women in leadership positions. But then also there's there's also a much longer story. And there, of course, were women for decades before who had been trying to study but not allowed. And so it's an interesting question of sort of where you begin the story and what the perspective is. Rav Claudia, you're kind of in the midst of, you're coming from a very different place and context, but with a different kind of angle, and tell us a little bit about your journey.
I am happy to tell you, though I feel like most of you know my journey. I've told it so many times in different opportunities, but I'll use this opportunity to kind of tell the chronological order of my journey to becoming a rabbi. And I think that my story, there is both the chronological, the time, which is in between Carol and Rav Tiferet, right? Rabbi Carol and Rav Tiferet. But it's also geographical, very different, because I was in South America. So I remember as a little kid, and as you all know, my father was a rabbi. My father was the first ordained of the Seminario Rabbinico Latinoamericano in Buenos Aires, the seminary in Buenos Aires, that was founded by Rabbi Marshall Maya, who was a graduate from JTS. But I remember as a kid not only not knowing women rabbis, not knowing that it was possible, not knowing that its existence, not knowing anywhere, even though they already existed. I was born in '74, so when I was a teenager, there were already women rabbis. I remember my father coming back from the United States from his conventions. He will come for the Rabbinical Assembly conventions and talking about all the things the Americans were doing, like up north. And this is before internet, before all the news moved much slower, right? So it was happening up there in the north, but there was no way in Chile and South America but I wanted to be a rabbi since I was a little kid. Now, when I was a little kid and I imagined I was going to be a rabbi, I imagined I'll be a rabbi like my dad. I had no context around what it meant gender. I didn't ask questions about gender. It was like, I wanted to be like my dad. It wasn't such a big deal. And I even I had a picture, actually, I'm very sad. I lost this picture the day of my ordination, because we brought it to my ordination party and we passed it around and it never came. But I had a picture of myself around 5-year-old, the age of my younger one, dressed up as a rabbi. And dress up as a rabbi meant wearing a full, in Spanish is a toga, a robe, and my dad led services with those kind of hats that rabbis are, and a talit, like a thin talit, and I put round glasses from my dad, and my dad had a beard like this, I don't know how you call it, but he had that. So I do look physically a little bit like my dad. So I was like a 5-year-old dressed up like her father. And that's what it meant. I wanted to be a rabbi, and it was a joke and it was funny. And if you were to meet anyone from my childhood, they all knew I wanted to be a rabbi, but no one put it together. I never put it together. I wanted to be a rabbi, to be a camp rabbi, because I love camp. I love summer camp. And my dad, as the rabbi of the community, was also the director of the summer camp. He was rabbi, was everything in his community. So I thought if I become a rabbi camp, I could go to camp all year long. That's what was my dream. Oh, we could be summer camp all year long. That's how I thought. I was always interested, very part of the community. We were 3 sisters, and I was the middle one that would walk to shul with my dad early on Shabbat morning, and my sisters would come later for kiddush or not come at all. I was the one that when we played games at home, we played, and I was a rabbi taking the toy Torah and making my sisters, so I don't think I enjoyed so much, sit for services with me. And since you can imagine it, you can totally see it. And now I see my kids, I can also see it even more so. And but I never put it together. When I moved to Argentina and I lived there, I started to study in the seminario there, where my father went to rabbinical school. And I started to have some thoughts about becoming a rabbi, but I decided not to. I did not know. I did not have role models. I did not know what it meant. I did have role models of educators were women. So I thought, why do I need to be a rabbi? I can be a Jewish educator. And I can dedicate my life to Judaism without the rabbinate. And I kind of like the fact that it was not happening around me made me believe that it was not possible. And I think at that point I was also trying to rebel against my dad. I didn't want to be like my dad anymore. So becoming a rabbi would mean I would be like him. And after the tragedy of my mother's death, I moved to Israel. And when I moved to Israel, I was doing a master's, BA, on Jewish studies. And then I moved to Jerusalem to do a master's in Jewish studies. And I was very much into, I can live a very strong Jewish life and be a role model for Jewish life. But I was missing. I didn't know what it would mean by this point to become a rabbi as a woman. And it was until I started to meet rabbinical students. I was in a Master of Jewish Studies at the Schechter Institute, and I was taking most of the class with rabbinical students. Rabbinical students thought I was a rabbinical student, even though I was in a different program. They kept confusing me. And I was meeting them, and they had Chavruta, and it was the first time I studied in Chavruta in my life, and all this was happening. And a part of me was still very convinced I didn't need the rabbiness that it is. And when the dean of the rabbinical school then, Rabbi David Golinkin, who's now the president of the Schechter Institute, called me to his office. I was taking a class with him about tefillin and women, and all we were taking a class about women's mitzvot. And he said, why aren't you in the rabbinical school? Why are you in the master program? And why don't you just transfer to the rabbinical? So I really was speechless. I remember sitting in his office, very moved that he called me to his office. And my first answer was because the Israeli program that I would transfer to was only for Israelis. You had to be an Israeli citizen, and I was, and I had a student visa. So because I guess I'll need to make Aliyah. And he said, so just make Aliyah. And I'm like, I don't know, really? And it's like, yeah, I think you should apply. And I remember writing a fax this time, a very long fax to my father. I went to my friend who had a fax machine. Everybody has to have a friend with a fax machine, to send that fax to my father to ask him, should I make Aliyah and become a rabbi? And I spent a week or so. He gave me, the Rabbi Golinkin gave me a week to think, so I should apply. A week, I did not sleep for a whole week. Literally, I did not sleep. I wasn't sure how to do this. I have always heard from my father that to become a rabbi, you had to have this. It was a vocation. It wasn't a career choice. It was something that was beyond the choices you make. It was chosen for you. That's how my father spoke about it. God wanted him to be a rabbi. So I was feeling that was too much for me. It's like, I don't know what God wants from me. I don't know what I want from my own life. I don't know if God will tell me what God wants from me. I remember feeling this very, very intensely. And I remember making lists. I do like making lists of pros and cons, what yes, what no. And the idea of making Aliyah, that's a whole other story, was part of this conversation and decision. And that Shabbat, I went to Davin, to a minyan, which is also another story. It's the Litter Minyan, which is a minyan led by Eben and Eben's family. And this is before Eben was part of my life. And Eben was leading services, which is a whole other story, but we didn't know each other. And I remember during the davening, remembering the story, the joke that maybe all of you might know in some way or another, of the person that drowns on the sea and is about to die, and an helicopter comes to save that person. Said, no, don't save me. God is going to come to save me. And then a boat comes. No, God is going to save me. Like all those things that happen come to save, and then the person doesn't take the cues to be saved and dies and goes to heaven and confront God, and the person said, I believed in you, I had faith, God, that you were going to save me. And God says, I sent you a helicopter, I sent you a boat, I sent you this, I sent you that, and you didn't pick it, you didn't take it. How do you want me to show you that you were going to be saved? And I remember, it was Musaf, I totally remember thinking about this story and going to my friend and saying, that's what it is. Like, God is not going to come in the middle of the night and tell me, God, Claudia, you should become a rabbi. That's not how it's happening. What are all the signs in my life that have brought me to this moment to apply to become a rabbi? And that's the next day, on Sunday, which is a school day in Israel, I went to the dean of the rabbinical school and I said, I'm going to apply. And I applied, and I made Aliyah. I just went to rabbinical school at Machon Schechter. I was ordained in 2002. And my first job was the rabbi of camp, which is the reason I wanted to be a rabbi. I decided that was what I was doing. I figured it out. And for 3 years, I was the rabbi of Noam, which is the youth movement of the Masorti movement. Think USY, think Camp Ramah. And I was the rabbi of Camp Ramah in Israel for 3 years. And it was really like, that's why I did it. And that was my journey to the rabbinate. So I feel very blessed that I had a journey like this, and that I can tell it in this way. And I'm grateful for all the women that came before me, like Carol, and like all those who fought and who couldn't do it in the way they wanted, because without them, I wouldn't have been like the dean of the rabbinical school would have never come and invite me to apply. Thank you.
Thank you. I love that that your story is both very personal and very much about, the kind of personal calling and how meandering that can be, but also about the role that other people play in helping you find your personal journey, whether it's having role models who make that possible, or, you know, or having people who, you know, are your teachers who can help draw that that message into your consciousness, even if it's been sort of lingering in the subconscious for a long time. Rav Tiferet.
Thanks. So, wow, it's just been so great listening to these stories. So yeah, I'm from Brookline, Massachusetts. And, you know, my very first memory, I started with that to say, you know, we were not, I didn't grow up around a lot of other African-American people. I had some neighbors who were African-American, but like for the most part, I grew up in a very white, Jewish, Catholic world. And at the time, I didn't have any role models of women clergy of any faith. My first memory of like having an inkling towards spirituality is when I was 7 years old. I remember going, like after my parents thought I was asleep, I put on my dad's bathrobe and I turned one of my like night tables upside down and I lined up all of my stuffed animals on my bed and I went behind the it was like a bima. I made a bima and I went and gave a sermon about how important it was to love God. And then I ran to sit with my stuffed animals and I was like, shh, you have to be quiet. You know, the minister is talking. But yeah, so, but I had never seen a female pastor. And I had never expressed any desire to be a clergy member. So luckily no one shot them down, right? I just didn't tell anyone. And then I went to Catholic school there in Brookline also. And, you know, obviously there are no female priests, right? Like that's still not a thing. And there were no nuns either. So there was and there was a male principal. So like there were just no strong female leadership role models at Catholic school for me either. And we were not Catholic. But, you know, I discovered my love for text. When I was in 6th grade, it was the first time I had religion classes and I had a religion textbook. And there were so many stories in the text that like illustrated the textures of the characters. And I was like, this is amazing. So I would, I remember like going to, you know, most people take like the newspaper into the bathroom. I would take my religion book into the bathroom and like, it's like highlighting and writing notes. And I wrote sermons and I delivered them and I, you know, had all these journals. So like, I was really into looking at the problems of the world and like relating it to text and like making it meaningful. And nobody else was about that. Around me, like my I don't know what was wrong with my 6th and 7th grade friends. They weren't into writing Divrei Torah, but that was like something I continued to love even through high school, finding comfort in our texts. Fast forward to college, and I discovered Judaism, and I really just started imbibing it, and I was like, this is great. Look at all of this. Look at all this, like these stories and these ways of expressing spirituality and all of this culture and these different paths to God. And like, I imbibed it. I can't think of another word for it. I was at the Hyde Park Library, just like blowing through books one summer. And so then I met with the rabbi as I was beginning my journey towards Judaism. And you know, most people when they're coming to convert to Judaism, they ask like, you know, practical questions like, can I still have a Christmas tree? Or, you know, like, tell me what's the meaning of Shabbat or da-da. And so I was talking with the rabbi about, you know, differences between like the Gemara and the Mishnah and like where authority comes from and all of these other things. And she was like, well, if you're going to like dive in that deep, maybe you should go to rabbinical school. And I thought, okay, I had no idea what that meant. But I said, okay, so it's going to rabbinical school. And when I got to the classes of, because, people who are converting to Judaism have to take formal classes, I got to the class taking portion of it. And like, I could have taught those classes. They were very basic. And so I went to the rabbi and I said, I love this. This is like chutzpah, but like, I was like, these classes are very basic. Can I teach a class like more advanced? And like, how can I change this process? And she said, well, you have to be a rabbi to teach these classes. Now, both of the rabbis I encountered in my adult Jewish career were women. So it was like not a thing for me at that point. It was great. And I know I've heard from both of them, their stories. So I stand on their shoulders having, and their struggles. But for me, I was like, okay, you're a rabbi, I can go be a rabbi, no problem. And my issue was being a Black woman rabbi. And, trying to navigate that terrain. And then when I started at Hebrew College, there were no other women in my class. And that's because when I started in 2007, but that's because it was a new program. I mean, now it's amazing. And even when I graduated, it was about 50-50, maybe even more, so more women than men. So I was really struggling with, how do I have a voice? How do I find my voice in our tradition in this, experience that's very different from, what I had experienced of Judaism outside. And I'm really grateful to all of the amazing teachers that I had, all of the strong women role models that I got to learn with at Hebrew College and still get to see, because we see them at TBZ, for continuing to model, like, what does it mean to be a rabbi? What does it mean to be a woman and a rabbi with the tradition that we've inherited?
So that is a wonderful segue to the next question, that question of what does it mean to find your voice in a tradition where to find your voice as a woman and a rabbi in a tradition where you actually aren't represented in that way. So, let's take a little bit of time. I'm so glad we started with these personal story journeys, because I think that is so important to understand the diversity. I think sometimes when people think about changes in tradition, they think, well, there's, of course, so much diversity in what rabbis are, and then we add women rabbis into that as if that's one thing, right? As if there's one way that happens. And of course, one of the important things that we have to understand when we look at women's history is that, of course, women's stories are just as diverse and rich and multifaceted as men's stories. It's not like there's all of history in its richness and then there's women's stories, right? It's just as diverse, and we need to delve into those differences and the variety. And this is a good example of that. But I think one of the things that we want to think about in that challenge of that Rav Tiferet articulated so beautifully, of how do you find your voice as a woman and a rabbi in the tradition, that speaks to both the beauty of being able to find it and to create it and bring it out, and the challenge of doing that. So I want us to address that piece of this quickly. And I'm going to also ask everybody who's in the room to participate by sharing in the chat one way in which you see how women's rabbinic leadership shows up in the Jewish community, in your communities or in other communities, where you see the impact of women in rabbinic roles in the community. And maybe we'll crowdsource that a little bit. But if each of you could mention one thing, I know there's so many different examples, but one thing that you think has been an important contribution of women's rabbinic leadership, and one challenge that you still see. And we will start with Rav Claudia for this one.
Thank you, Judith. So the question is to mention both one challenge and one thing that we see that has been positive, right? So thank you. So I think that there's so much, and it's hard to focus on one, but when I think about changes that I think have happened in the community, in the Jewish community and the world around women in the Rabbinate, I think women in clergy too, not just in Judaism, but we are focusing in our own communities. Of course, when I think about my own life, I think about parenting and the role of being a mother and a rabbi, and how that has changed the way we understand family and family dynamics and the rabbinate and the expectation of what's the rabbi as a parent, as a mother, hopefully also influencing male rabbis as parents and being part of a family. I grew up in a time where my father as a rabbi he was a rabbi. There was the Rebbetzin, and we saw my father for dinner, and his family obligations were very limited, as it was, and I think this is true in so many other careers. This is not specific of the rabbinate, but of course, I know that I feel very incredibly blessed to be in a community that I do not need to separate me being a parent and being a rabbi. And I know this is not true, and Rav Tiferet can speak about that, other synagogue experiences that she have had in every synagogue. A story that I think it's an example of change is you might not have been involved in this, even in our own fantastic TVZ community, before my older daughter was born, so that she's going to be 12 very soon. There were so many meetings. We had so many conversations about changing tables in the bathrooms. This is before the remodeling. There were fewer and older bathrooms. So many conversations. I remember and no one thought it was needed. We don't really need changing tables. It's going to be too complicated. Where we would put them, it was like on and on. And there were parents asking for it. And there was no wanting to that. As soon as my daughter was born, a member of our congregation, I don't know if she's here, went to look around, I don't think I saw her, came and donated a changing table, and it was put in the bathroom. It was before we did the remodelations, in the bathroom that are now next to Rav Tiferet's office. And from that moment, there were changing tables, because of course we needed a changing table. I was going to come every day, and a lot of times with a baby that needed to change diapers. I was not going to change her diapers in the floor. And I remember other parents coming to say, like, finally, there's a changing table in our shul. And we needed a person in leadership to have a baby with a changing table for this discussion not to be an issue anymore. This happened.
Was it immediately clear that there would be a changing table in all the bathrooms? Or
No. Of course not. No, it was the bathroom that was not. It's not gender bathroom, so that was easy. But once we did the remodel, it was clear that we would need. I don't know actually. Yeah, and we made sure that there is a changing table also downstairs in the bathroom, in the male bathroom. So. Great question. So I think that was a moment for me realizing that. I'm going to share one more thought about this, which is about text, because Rav Tiferet spoke so beautifully about text. And I think that one of the things that I encounter very profound around women and the rabbinate is that when we think about text and text learning, and not just women in the rabbinate, but women scholars, women's voices in how we learn and study Torah. Judith Ketz is here, Gail Reimer are here, like people that have been studying text for so many years and writing it from women's perspective. So really thinking about how the text, the Jewish texts that have been written by men and for men, what is the opening that when other experiences come to dialogue with this text, it becomes much more rich. So now we read text with other experiences, and I think that's a profound thing of change. And I think inequalities and challenges still continue to exist. Again, I feel very blessed in our community, and I'm sure you can speak, Judith, a little bit more about the larger community. But I can share, for example, that right now I am a part of a group of interfaith leadership from all over the country. We are around 25 women or not identify women working with Tara Moore. Some of you might know her. She's an author. She wrote a book called Playing Big, Practical Wisdom for Women Who Want to Speak Up, Create, and Lead. And Tara invited a group of interfaith clergy to we meet every other week for a couple of hours, because she shared the story of how in the summer, as was the pandemic, she was looking, she's Jewish, she was looking for some Torah teaching, some podcast for some learning that she was doing, and she realized that once again women were outnumbered, that most of them were men, or they were always the same women that write op-eds, that do podcasts, that are out in the world sharing Torah, that it's still very difficult. If you Google something about it, it will be mostly men. So she created a project now for faith leaders, not just Jewish, and it's an incredibly interfaith group where we are coming together to do this kind of work, of developing our voices out in the world, so we can write more, so we can and share the wisdom that we have. And in these meetings, we are talking a lot about how we carry the insecurities of thousands of years of religion being led by men, written by men, and for men. And even if we are out there in the world and feeling good about our own communities, we're still carrying there when we try to be more public about the messages that we want to share.
Right. I think that's an important piece about both the inner work that needs to be done, even as the outer work is making its impact felt. Those two pieces go hand in hand. Carol, can you give us an example?
Sorry, I had a little trouble unmuting myself there. I think that women have opened up what is permissible or what is of interest to talk about, either from the Bima or within the Jewish community. That there are, as Rav Claudia said, issues about family and parenting, but just issues about relationships and how women look at power and power sharing. I think that and to look at biblical stories and other parts of Jewish narrative history from a feminist lens just didn't happen very much before. So I think that's that, and that I think is connected just to creativity in general. That, my story a lot of it started with collecting creative ritual. It started with baby naming ceremonies for Jewish girls and just grew. And I think that women having a different perspective brought in a certain degree of creativity, which then the Jewish community in general picked up on. In terms of a challenge, I think that there's still a tendency to sometimes be a rabbi that means being like a male rabbi, or like old time rabbis that were all male, and women are still figuring out to some degree how to do it differently. And there are so many rabbis now, male and female, who are doing all kinds of things that people wouldn't have imagined a rabbi doing as a profession, whether it's art or farming or all these entrepreneurial positions. And I think women have really, that's a piece of the creativity as well.
Yeah, I think it's so important, the point that the changes that have happened because of women's involvement in rabbinic leadership don't just affect women and girls, right? That they actually change the whole nature of rabbinic leadership for anyone and open up those possibilities. The same way that ritual creativity, like baby naming ceremonies for girls, then led people to think, well, we're doing all this creative stuff for girl babies. Maybe we should look at the bris again and think about how to be more creative around that. We don't have to, keep our creativity in one pot. And how that spreads out. But it takes a long time to change culture and to change the model. And I remember my mom again saying that at the beginning they were really just thinking about
Judith, sorry, you should say who's although I think some of us know exactly who your mom was and how important she was, but I don't know if most of the people in our community know about your mom. So could you say just a word about her?
Sure. I don't want to take too much time because I want to make sure we have time for questions. But my mom was a historian and an early Jewish feminist activist, and she was part of a group called Ezrat Nashim that grew out of the Chavurah movement in New York, out of the Jewish counterculture, but and began as a study session about women who were trying to understand, well, we're changing so many things and being so countercultural in so many ways. Why are we not maybe thinking as creatively about gender, and wanted to explore the history of Jewish women, and very, very quickly realized they didn't actually just want to study it, that they wanted to be activists around it. And so this group of young women who were from the ages of 18 and 27 became a group that advocated for change. They began with the conservative movement because many of them came from the conservative movement, and they also felt that change was beginning to happen in the reform movement, and it was going to be way too hard for it to happen at that moment in the Orthodox community. They really first began with questions of access to public leadership roles, like being a rabbi or being called to the Torah or being able to be a shaliach tzibor, to lead services or to become a witness, to be able to be a cantor, for women to be members of synagogues, those kinds of things. They also were attentive to the needs of single women and the kind of model for how women could participate in Jewish communities, that women shouldn't only be able to participate as married women and mothers, that there should be a role for single women. So that was sort of one of the more radical aspects of their work that I think there's still a lot of work left to be done. But one of the things that my mom said is we didn't recognize at the beginning that we weren't just talking about access. That was what we could first imagine. But then, of course, once we had access, we realized, it's not just about having access and then being a rabbi the way a rabbi always was. It was about changing the whole nature of how community worked and functioned and what leadership looked like. And these things take a little time to inhabit. Rav Tiferet.
I'll just tell a quick story about, this my positive. One of the things I think is changing is a comfort with sexuality. I remember fondly, as I said, I was like the only woman in my class for a long time. And, we had to do this final in Talmud, and I had a male teacher and all male classmates, and we could talk about whatever. And I talked about, women and sex in the Talmud. And it was the most fantastic presentation I think I've ever given, and it was great fun to research it, to see what's said in our tradition, and I just don't know if it felt like something that it felt freeing to do this as a woman, to be able to look into what the rabbis are saying about women in sexual positions and all of this stuff. Because usually when we're talking about women and sexuality, it's about menstruation. So there's there's other stuff out there, and it felt good to unlock that. Some of the challenges, I just thinking, practically undervaluing women's work, which is not women's work, but the work that women are doing, which is a problem across all sectors. And like Rav Claudia was talking about, family, and what does it mean to be a parent, to be a wife, and to be a rabbi. because society, says that there are different duties, and how to not even how do we balance that, but how do we deal with people's expectations of what that's going to look like. And I was in a position with my little one when she was. I didn't have anyone to watch her one Shabbos morning, so I had to come to shul with the baby and put her next to the bima. And some people were very upset because she was making noise, and it was disturbing their Shabbos service. And it's like, well, if you're not gonna pay for me to have childcare as a, because I have a family, then what do you want? And it didn't become a conversation. Like, it was just this is your situation that you need to figure out. So that's a challenge. Thank God we don't have those challenges at TBZ.
I think that's a really important reminder and reframe, and that one of the things that, and I encountered this in my own work at the Jewish Women's Archive, that when I, speak to communities about the importance of teaching women's stories, sometimes they'll say, oh, we don't need to worry about that. We have a woman rabbi, as if like having a woman on the bima solves all other problems. Now, it does make a big impact in terms of just, the symbolism is powerful and the role model piece is obviously huge, but you still have to, get beyond the surface level of that, of the visual, right? And dig deeper to think about, well, is that rabbi being paid as much as her male counterparts? Is she able to become a senior rabbi? Are, female rabbinical students getting the same kinds of placements? What is it like to be a single woman on the pulpit? What kind of maternity leave is there in childcare? What are the ways in which women's bodies are policed when they are in these kinds of public roles? What are the different kinds of jobs that are given to women in the rabbinate? Is there more of a tendency to kind of push women towards more of the caring work and less of the scholarship and teaching, and kind of like Torah study piece? So there's so many different pieces of that, and I'm sure we will continue to explore some of those issues throughout this week. I want to make sure that we have a little bit of time for your questions. So feel free to ask your questions. You can put them in the chat, or you can raise your hand and we will call on you to ask your question.
I'll answer. Leah put an interesting question on the chat, if I may. She asked the question if women rabbis are concerned that if women gradually become the majority rabbi. I don't think. Remember, we are the liberal. I am not concerned. I actually, there's something about that question that I think I don't know what, but I find it not only I'm not concerned, but also I think that we're so far from that. And I think that it's not about women taking over. And I know that many times people are anxious and nervous about too many women in our boards, or too many women reading Torah, or too many. I think we have to think this collectively and historically. Like, for 2,000 years, women did not have a voice to raise, and for 5,000 years, and now we are raising that voice. I'm not worried. Men will continue to have their voices very well heard, and if we can, we are going to influence boys and girls and people who are non-binary, and I think gender is changing. So it's a question. I'm having a hard time saying why, but it's a question that I find it very hard in some way. I don't know why. Maybe Judith, you understand what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there's two pieces of it. One piece is about the anxiety about the feminization of a field, and the feminization of religion, and the feminization of Judaism. And there's been a lot that's been written about that. Sometimes it's just called, like, the boy problem. Like, what are we going to do with boys if they, don't feel welcome in these spaces anymore? And I think that often that anxiety, it comes from a sense that any place where women are in leadership must not be a place that men would feel comfortable, as if women being there somehow makes it less desirable. So that's the piece that we really need to attack. The idea that just because women inhabit a space, it is therefore not a space that men would want to be associated with. And often, of course, we know that the places that women, the jobs that become feminized then become less attractive to men, they become less well paid, all those kinds of things. So I think that is a real dynamic, but one that we have to fight, that we have to kind of go at from the angle of saying, let's think about how we devalue things where women are present, or think of places where women are present as somehow no longer safe spaces for men. I think also it just speaks to the ways in which we are all trained to worry a lot about men and taking care of men and their needs. There's nothing wrong with worrying about every human and taking care of their needs, but we are really very deeply geared towards worrying about men and what's going to happen to men. And I don't want anything bad to happen to men, but I'm interested in really thinking about what happens to women and other people who have not had their voices heard or have not had been welcomed into places of leadership. So that's where I think we need to put our energy for a while.
Can I jump in?
Please.
So I think about this also because I've had parents, ask a very similar question at Beit Rabban, like how do we make sure that my son has role models that they can see themselves in? Because like, as we know, representation is so important. And so I definitely think about this question a lot, but from the perspective that you're mentioning, Judith, and that how do we make sure that everyone, as many people as we possibly can, have safe space, can see representation? So how do we make sure that it's not a concern of having, too many women or not enough men, but we have these kinds of people. Are there whatever those kinds of people are in leadership? Do we have teachers who fill this model? So I think you're absolutely right in thinking about it in a global perspective with a smaller G.
Yeah, thank you. Any other questions?
I don't have a question, but one of the things that I find is, and this can sound arrogant, I've been told that I can be arrogant, but I find that women have to be better. The women rabbis, they have to have a grasp of everything that the men have, and then they have to have more. In terms of bringing everything into the world, so that, I don't know, I mean, and not all women rabbis have that capacity. Some do, some bad male rabbis also. But generally I find that women, they have to just be able to do what is expected of men, and then also have all that stuff that is expected of women. And if you, and I don't know if any of the women here have had that issue, the rabbis, but I find that if you're too forceful sometimes, it's not seen as something that's assertive. It's almost like, oh, well, the person's being aggressive, or they're not hearing me. So I admire the fact that so many women, and the women at TBZ, are able to do everything that the men can do, and do that more, because that's a talent, and it's almost like something that's inside of someone, and that it comes out, and at the same time they still keep their humanity, and they're not. And if I don't know, because in everything, like I said, sometimes some people might think it's arrogance, but it doesn't come across as that. It comes across as just knowledge, caring, and humanity. And I don't know, maybe some of the rabbis can talk about that. Have they ever had an experience where they have spoken up, and either men or women have tried to silence them because they're not being caring enough, and their assertiveness is being seen as something that might be aggressive?
Thank you for that question. It's the backwards and heels issue, right? That everything, it's Ginger Rogers is doing everything Fred Astaire does, but backwards and in heels, and women rabbis are in a similar situation. Would any of you like to address that question with a personal story? can be hard sometimes to talk about these things in your own community. So I want to recognize that it
I worked as a Hillel rabbi with another rabbi on campus, a more senior rabbi, and myself. I was the part-time rabbi, I guess. And I spoke up in disagreement about something at a board meeting. And I think that I did it in a kind way. And yet I was scolded afterwards for speaking up, not thinking through what I had to say. And I think there was a sense of I should have just stayed in the background. That was the feeling that I had.
We have time for one more question. Judith?
I just want to respond to what Naomi put in the chat about the generational thing. And, coming after two male rabbis who had gone, emeritus, they had been there for a really long time. So, people were so attached to, who the rabbi was and the ways that the rabbi did things. And now there's this woman and a Black woman, so it does take time. Change takes time, and some congregations aren't ready to let go, aren't ready to grow, aren't ready to change in that way. But I think we're part of it's a bigger shift. So it's like you have to get with it.
When I went to work for a large congregation in Minneapolis, I wasn't even a rabbi yet, and I was asked to go in to the morning minyan on Sunday morning and lead the service. This is after I'd been there for Shabbat and had spoken on the bima, etc. And I wore my talit and tefillin into this all-male, older men morning minyan. And they just sort of looked at me, and I just introduced myself and said I was here to lead the service. And I didn't know what they were going to do, but by the end of the service, somehow they didn't realize that I was sort of shaking, and we warmed up to each other. And I think it's true of Minneapolis, which is a very liberal, conservative Jewish community, conservative with a big C. And so I think they were more ready for women in leadership positions and in rabbinic positions than other communities. But for these older guys, it was really, it was a sense of, well, here's a woman who knows what she's doing, and this is our tradition, and we're doing our morning service together. And I mean, I was blessed that it was that smooth. But some of those guys were like, just, they were my good friends by the end of a year or so there. And so sometimes the generational thing is not the issue, I guess is what I want to say.
I saw that Judith Cates had her hand up, and Gail asked a question in the chat. So maybe we'll hear Judith's question and then take Judith and Gail's question together, and you can address what you like.
What I wanted to ask was has to do with a great feeling of empathy with many of the things that people have. All three of you have been saying. I wanted to ask you if you'd be willing to share something about the experience of studying text. I think that many of us who've been involved in really loving and caring deeply about classical Jewish texts, about not only Bible, Tanakh, but also Talmud and Midrash, when you start to really learn, there are places and times when you encounter things that are just incredibly painful. As a woman, things that are so disturbing that people who are considered to be the great teachers of our tradition are saying about women. There's a whole process of trying to learn to deal with a sense of injustice and anger, and find some creative ways to work with not only those texts, but with the fact that we have a tradition that includes these texts as part of its the authoritative, respected, venerated scripture that we hand down from one generation to the next. So I'm wondering if you'd be willing to say something about what that's been like for you, and the process of becoming a teacher within that tradition.
I am happy to go with that for a few moments, and I'll respond quickly to Gail's question too about women rabbi or rabbi. I am a rabbi. I'm a woman. I'm a mother. I'm a spouse. I'm a Latina. I'm a Jew. I'm a rabbi. And I have I want to live in a world where I'm introduced just as a rabbi, and I don't need to be always like. I'm a rabbi that happened to be a woman. Not that happened. I don't like that happen either. But I think that we still are fighting that, and it's part of this whole conversation. And regarding the text, I find it's such a profound issue, and I have so many stories and so many memories of crying while studying with a chavruta when reading a text, that it's so hurtful and so hard. Like I remember that profoundly. I also remember in a class in rabbinical school where we were studying halacha, the Jewish law. We were studying all the ilchot nida, all around nida and menstruation, etc. And the teacher was a man, a wonderful teacher, Moshe Benovich in Yerushalayim, and he was explaining what the rabbis were explaining about the different colors that you can find in your underwear to recognize what kind of blood this is. I remember a few of us, including another amazing woman that with Judith were one of the first ones to put on tefillin, a good dear friend of Judith, Ayelet Cohen, Rabbi Ayelet Cohen, the two of us just standing in class and starting to yell at this teacher and say, you cannot teach us about menstruation. Can we teach our classmen? We were 20 something. We were like we have this 40-year-old teacher trying to explain to us about the colors of menstruation. And I remember that moment. But this is where I go to the story that I love so much from our tradition of Rabbi Akiva sitting, Moshe Rabbeinu sitting on the back of the Beit Midrash of Rabbi Akiva, and the clear and the deep understanding that Torah, Moshe Sinai, the Torah from Sinai, is the Torah that continues to develop over the years, and that when Moshe went to the Beit Midrash of Rabbi Akiva, and he didn't understand what was happening there, and Rabbi Akiva said, "This is what Torah is." I want to say that the Torah that we are teaching, that whenever I quote the book of Judith Cates and Gail Rimmer, or when I quote Rabbi Sharon Cohen Anisfeld new commentary of that, or when I quote Rabbi Carol Glass on that, or Rabbi Tiferet Birnbaum on that, they're in dialogue with Rabbi Akiva and Moshe Rabbeinu in the same way, and that what we need is to encounter these texts I encounter them with anger, with sadness, but hopefully bringing the new voices that are also Torah min hashamayim. So for me, that's the way I envision this.
Beautiful, really beautiful.
That was beautiful, Claudia. And I think maybe a good place for us to end this, because I think that it gestures both to the fact that this is ongoing work, and also to the importance of having these conversations and making sure that we include all of these voices in the kind of broader Jewish text that we're creating, right? That we're constantly writing. This is where that theme of sisterhood comes in, because women have expanded the tradition so that more voices are included, so that when women are studying today, they will encounter many women's voices within their studies, and they won't feel quite as alone and embattled. And maybe they'll have female teachers in the front of the room who will present text in different ways or be asking different kinds of questions. I want to thank all of you for participating in this conversation tonight, to the three rabbis for sharing their stories and for modeling their leadership of our communities. I also wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't point you all to JWA's collection on women rabbis. And I will say, when we put up this collection, which includes the stories of, right now, I think 76 women rabbis, video interviews that, of course, are not comprehensive, but give you a sense of the roles that women are playing in the rabbinate all around the world, both their individual stories and the common themes and historical progression. There were some people who said, why are you calling this women rabbis instead of just rabbis? But we felt like it was really important to highlight the gender piece, because otherwise also we lose the story of how history is made and how change happens. We, of course, long for a time when women rabbis will just be rabbis. And also we recognize that it's a process of social change, and we want to honor that piece of it as well. So I'm going to put the link to that in the chat. There are many more stories there if you want to continue on this thread. There will also be many opportunities this week to continue some of these themes. And I know that Leah wants to say a little bit about the session that she's doing later this week.
Rav Claudia, what you just said fits so perfectly, because you're talking about studying texts as women and knowing what the men don't know. And one of the focuses of our session on Tuesday is Helene Aylan, who as an artist focused on those very issues in an artistic way that was so meaningful, as she tried to grapple with her love of Judaism, but also feeling like crying. So I hope the rest of you will come, and there's going to be an announcement of a video you can watch ahead of time, and Gail Reimer is an interviewer on that video of the artist. So hope to see you there. Thank you.
So thank you all. Thank you, Rabbi Carol, Rav Claudia, Rav Tiferet. We're so grateful for your stories. Thank you all for being part of this conversation. And we will continue to create a community where our voices are always in dialogue with the text and making room for more voices to join in.
Thank you, Judith, for being such a fabulous moderator of this panel, and Rabbi Carol and Rav Tiferet. It's so wonderful to be in a community where there are so many rabbis. I saw also Rabbi Mona Strick is here, and she's there. Is there any other rabbis in the room that I can see?
Yes, Judy Coomer is here also.
Where are you, Judy?
I didn't have my camera.
Oh, that's your phone. Okay. Judy
Sorry.
Coomer. I didn't know with Judy's iPhone. So Rabbi Judy Coomer, who is also part of our community. And there are many more rabbis in our community that it's always wonderful to have. So thank you, everybody. Rav Tiferet, put the rest of the schedule. Anything else you want to announce, Rav Tiferet, before we end the evening? Sorry, I just touched you. You unmuted, and then I muted you by mistake. Sorry.
No, I wanted to echo your thanks, and I'm looking forward to this week as we begin International Women's Month. That we continue to lift up women's voices and women's stories.
Thank you. Laila Tov, everybody.
So much.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.